Modern stories have a tendency, almost an obligation, to paint revenge as a cautionary tale. You know the beats. A character is wronged, they pursue vengeance, and in the end, they're hollow. They've lost more than they've gained. The moral? Forgiveness is better, mercy is nobler, and revenge will only eat you alive. It's a tidy message, but it's also a bit of a lie, and one of the laziest ways to convey revenge in modern storytelling. I'm Cheshire, and today, we're talking about why character revenge is a good thing, actually. Part 1. The binary of revenge. Revenge is most often depicted as a morally gray act that toes the line between blind and vigilante justice. There are most definitely outliers to this rule, but by and large, revenge is either seen as good or bad, depending on the story and character. Here's the thing, though. Sometimes, revenge is good, great even, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise. So many stories will craft a compelling revenge tale only to hammer home the idea that the protagonist must make peace with their demons and forgive their enemy so as not to become like them. A classic example of this is how Disney portrays its heroes. While Disney isn't exactly known for their revenge tales, they are masters at protecting the hero's image in the eyes of the audience. Such stories will showcase how the hero has defeated the villain, but can't deliver the final blow because that would make them just as bad or something. Instead, the hero will turn their back to the defeated villain, only to be attacked from behind and forced to kill them in an act of self-defense. All to keep their moral purity intact. That way, the hero can be seen as the good guy, who didn't execute a defeated enemy. But in the case of revenge tales, all that creates is frustration from the audience, when the character chooses the moral high ground instead of delivering the final blow. This line of thinking is best showcased in how Batman delivers justice. He won't kill even the most evil of criminals to uphold his ideals and be the better person. Tell me, how many more people have been killed by the Joker because Batman chose to live by his code? Sometimes, the villain is completely irredeemable, and the world would be better off if the protagonist finished the job. Revenge stories will sometimes try to portray the act of revenge as wrong, no matter how much the villain made the protagonist and world suffer. Such revenge stories choose to take the high road, with the protag being the better person. Not bad as far as lessons go, but in the context of revenge, it misses a fundamental story beat. Catharsis is the end goal for all good revenge stories. Only once the protagonist overcomes all odds and manages to triumph over the object of their obsession will there be a cathartic moment that makes the entire conflict worth it. The more traumatic and tragic the inciting incident is, the greater the cathartic release will be for the audience and the protagonist. Because that's all revenge stories are. Broken down to their core components, revenge stories rely on conflict, obsession, and catharsis. That being said, it can work well when the protagonist chooses to forgive, depending on the character. But such moments risk robbing the viewer's time, especially if the target of said revenge is inherently evil and has done unspeakable acts. The worse the offense, the harder it will be for both the character and audience to come to terms with forgiveness and choosing the moral high road. But that ultimately comes down to the character's agency and lack thereof. Part 2. Agency and Revenge. Character agency is something that every story deals with differently. When the protagonist is reactive to the plot, they are viewed as passive characters, and those types of protagonists aren't all that interesting. However, when the protagonist is actively shaping the plot through their decisions and actions, then they are seen as active and effective. Their agency is in their own hands, and in the case of revenge plots, revenge only comes after their agency has been taken away from them, usually through conflict and loss during the inciting incident. This is usually when a loved one is killed before their eyes by the big bad, or some other type of tragedy occurs where the main character loses enough to justify a quest of revenge. Because it's not enough for a tragic event to occur in the story to justify revenge. A good revenge story is one of audience participation. What do I mean by this? We, the audience, can't empathize with a character who tells us about how they've been wronged. But when we are shown, often in brutal detail through the eyes of the character themselves, then we begin to emotionally connect with their struggle. This is where show don't tell comes into play. You may have heard this term before, and while show don't tell often gets a bad rep, it is generally useful advice for newer writers. And in the case of revenge stories, show don't tell can become one of the most effective tools in any writer's toolbox. Because on a basic level, revenge stories are pretty generic. They all have a near universal pattern to them. Character A gets wronged by character B, and character A makes it their mission to get revenge. The exact steps are up to the individual writer, but the starting and ending point are pretty much decided. And that's where show don't tell comes in. During the inciting incident, it's a writer's job to make an emotional connection to the audience. Show don't tell makes it much easier for audiences to empathize with the plight of a character and even root for their success, even if their actions are morally bankrupt. What separates a good revenge story from a great one comes down to one simple idea: emotion. Revenge is just the byproduct of experiencing extreme negative emotions. When revenge grows organically from real, witnessed trauma, when we feel the injustice and want it avenged, then the act of revenge isn't just seen as good, but the audience will actively root for the character's success. Hooks are a way for writers to capture the attention of the reader or viewer to continue their story. In the case of revenge plots, however, not only is a good hook needed for the intro, but the tragedy needs to be a secondary hook within the inciting incident. The secondary hook must capture the audience's empathy into cheering for the character's inevitable revenge to succeed. The more the main character suffers, the better. Not only must the main character crave justice in the form of revenge, but the audience must want it just as badly, if not more. And the best way to do that is to completely take away the main character's agency during the tragedy. The less control they have, the better. Writers can use any number of ways to showcase agency being actively taken away from a character, and the only correct response in such stories is for the character to take back their agency, usually through violent means. The more loss and hardship the character experiences, the greater the audience will want to root for their revenge. Part 3. When justice fails, revenge steps in. The objective rule of law is a luxury many fictional worlds lack. And while the real world's justice system is far from perfect, it's still better than what most fictional characters are forced to endure. But no system, real or imagined, is flawless. There will always be cracks for injustice to slip through. Cue revenge's tantalizing appeal. Here's the central moral question that revenge stories often ask. What's the difference between justice and revenge? Justice, we're told, is fair and objective. Revenge is personal, emotional, dangerous. But what happens when justice, true justice, fails? When the courts don't convict the guilty, when the abuser walks free, when a loved one is murdered in front of the hero's eyes and there's no hope of legal retribution. In those moments, revenge doesn't feel evil, it feels right, because it answers a question that fiction and life rarely answers cleanly. What if no one comes to save you? That's why revenge stories endure. They step in when the system breaks down. They give a voice to the broken, the betrayed, the silenced. And in the best revenge stories, those voices speak not of peace, but of vengeance disguised as justice. Too often, revenge stories rely on a simple moral binary. The character is either justified or they aren't. But real life is rarely so clean. I'm all for a tidy thematic resolution, but if a story doesn't grapple with the complexity of its character's actions, it risks feeling hollow. A common fallback is to leave the protagonist jaded and empty once the revenge is complete. That can work, if that's earned through the character's development, but it only matters if there's something left to explore once the target of their revenge is gone. A great revenge story doesn't hand you the answer. It doesn't care if the main character replaces the villain. What matters is whether you still root for them after everything they've done. To summarize, revenge doesn't have to be morally right to feel right. That's the beauty of it, the messiness. When there's no clear right or wrong, when the protagonist commits evil to defeat evil, and we're all left to ask, does that make them the villain? Not all revenge stories end in blood. Sometimes the best retribution is political, poetic, or deeply personal. What matters is the catharsis, that split second when the audience and the character both feel the scales finally tip. Revenge is complex, it's uncomfortable, it's human, and the best revenge stories embrace that complexity instead of flattening it into a good versus evil narrative. I'm Cheshire, and thanks for watching.